I mean, I know most of you, and I'm really delighted that friends and new friends have joined. And I'm Prabha Kotishwaran, and along with me are Sophie, Shrirupa, Chitapa, and Shakti. And we are researching social reproduction in India. We're looking at 5 sectors of women's work, and in particular, sex work, surrogacy, bar dancing, paid and unpaid domestic work. And so we meet every Friday, the first Friday of every month, for these conversations on social reproduction. It's usually a much larger crowd, but we're really happy to have you join us. So do spread the word around. I'll now hand over to Shrirupa and Shakti, who will now manage the session.
Thank you, Prabha, and a warm welcome to everyone. I'll thank also Professor Chaitanya and welcome you for joining us with us today. And we're really excited to have you with us. So let me just quickly introduce our speaker today, who's Professor Chaitanya Lekinsetti. She's an associate professor of sociology at Texas A&M University. Her work centers on gender, sexuality, law, and citizenship. In her empirical and theoretical work, she employs transnational and intersectional approaches. She's the author of the book Legalizing Sex, Sexual Minorities, AIDS and Citizenship in India, published by NYU Press, which is the focus of our presentation today. And in her book, she examines how sexual and gender minorities demand legal and political citizenship in contemporary India. In particular, how the global HIV/AIDS crisis has transformed the relationship between gender and sexual minorities and the Indian state. So, of course, she'll be speaking more about it. Professor Lekinsetti's second project is on urban inequalities and intimate labor, with takes on transnational feminist lens to theorize marginalization of women from sexual labor in establishments called dance bars in the state of Maharashtra. Her work has been published in Science and Qualitative Sociology, Sexuality and Positions Asia Critic. Currently, she's also working on a comparative project on Me Too movements in India and the US in collaboration with her colleague, Dr. Vanitha Reddy. So, welcome again, Professor Chaitanya Lekinsetti, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Shrirupa. I really want to thank Prabha and Shrirupa and Shakti for inviting me. This is such a great honor. Especially, I was just telling you all before, people who just joined, that book came out in January, and I didn't get much of a chance to engage with other scholars. And this is also especially important for me to engage with scholars outside the US. So I'm really honored to be part of this seminar. I really want to hear your thoughts more about the book, but I will start it off by maybe speaking about the main interventions of the book and a few insights from the book, and then Shakti has her comments, and I'm open to having a conversation about the book. So I'll share a few slides. I have a few slides. I'll share the slides. Sorry, it's still a little early here, so. Could you see the slides?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So now I know I shared the PDF with some of you, but this is the book cover, and so as many of you, most of you know that sexual politics in India since the mid-1990s and of course in the 2000s. So very vibrant movements around sexuality and rights in India. So my work touches upon these really vibrant struggles of sexually marginalized groups. I use the umbrella term sexual minorities to include sex workers in that framework, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts about using that framework to include sex workers in the framework of sexual minorities. I'll also talk about why I thought it was productive to do that later. But one of the main questions that I was interested in thinking about is how are previously marginalized and stigmatized groups able to make claims over the Indian state, especially in the context of the anti-sodomy law struggles, NALSA judgment, and also sex workers' mobilizations against the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act. This was a context in which I was interested in exploring these questions and thinking about how does the state respond to these demands of previously marginalized groups. So the main theoretical argument of the book is that to be effective, biopolitical projects need the engagement of the governed, which means that the governed can also make demands on the state. I'll elaborate that a little bit more when I speak a little bit about the specific struggles. But that's one of the main arguments of the book, that when the state shares power with the marginalized groups, it opens up space for marginalized groups to make demands on the state. So the theoretical framework I employ is I think Foucauldian biopolitics as a way to think about the state and its need to manage populations in the context of a health crisis. So I use this framework not only to think about the state and transformations within the state, but also to think about how communities mobilize and demand the state for rights. Just as a way to bring this from Foucault's history of sexuality, modern states, biopolitics is a modern state's role in regulating life, reproduction, and human sexuality, health and illness, living and working conditions, and birth and death, right? How sex becomes central to state governance. I talk at length in the introduction about how post-colonial and feminist scholars have interrogated Foucault's work and advanced Foucault's work to think about post-colonial context. I'm not going to go much into that, but just talking about the theoretical framework real quick. This is just the layout of the book. It's really a small, it's not a bulky book, it's a small book in that sense. So these are the chapters. I am not going to summarize the chapters, but I do want to talk about three main interventions of the book that I feel like I'm still struggling with what the book is about. So I'm happy to hear more about what do you think are the interventions of the book. One of the first contribution of the book is the comparative approach that brings LGBTQIH. Here, K is used for Koti and Hijra, H is for Hijra, and sex worker politics in contemporary India. I think this was important because there's a significant overlap between these struggles in India. Sex workers, gay men, LGBTQ groups, MSM, sex workers, gay men, MSM, men who have sex with men, and trans women have been incorporated into the HIV/AIDS program at different stages of the AIDS policy in India. So there's already a significant overlap in terms of the biopolitical projects and how they involve marginalized groups into these projects. This incorporation has led to politicization of these communities. This is especially evident from the fact that we see the demands for rights-based struggles emerged since the mid-1990s, intensified by 2000s. The anti-sodomy law struggles, the struggles around the amendments that was introduced by Women and Child Development Ministry in 2005 around ICPA. Then also, in 2014, the NALSA judgment, and post-NALSA judgment, we have trans groups struggling to against the trans persons bill. So all of these just showcasing the vibrancy and richness of the struggles that are happening in India. Most of the sexuality, Western-centered sexuality studies have approached these struggles often separately, right? Gay and lesbian, queer, LGBTQ struggles are separate from trans struggles. Sex worker struggles are separate from LGBTQ struggles, right? But the Indian case showcases a considerable overlap in these struggles. Actually, trans sex workers being the bridge, right? They are at the cusp of these struggles, although I do not talk about separately about trans sex workers in the book, but I think it is something that is important to talk about. And also, because of the histories of legal regulation in India, regulation of prostitution, the Contagious Disease Act, the Anti-Sodomy Law, and the Criminal Tribes Act, all of these have these colonial legal histories. And I was interested in thinking about how these colonial regulations are being challenged and contested in the era of globalization, and particularly in the context of a global health crisis, right? In addition, the state also becomes a crucial site for sexual minority struggles in India. It's either through the demands for legal reform, challenging state legislation, and building social movements around legal change. So these are some of the reasons why this comparative approach was compelling for me. The second intervention is thinking about adding a layer of analysis to understanding biopolitics, not only as producing docile subjects, but also opening space for new political subjectivities. So Foucauldian approaches to sexuality focus more on discipline and regulation of subjects, but not so much on resistance. So even though resistance is very much part of a Foucauldian framework, right, where as Foucault famously says, where there is power, there is resistance. So the subjects that are produced in and through these biopower projects are not just docile, but are capable subjects who can manipulate, negotiate, and resist state power. In the sense that HIV/AIDS offers a discursive site for previously marginalized groups to engage with state, which by which I mean like it's also providing new lexicon or language like health of the nation, greater good, intervening in contributing to the health of the nation. That kind of a language that has been used sometimes to counter state juridical responses of the state. So in this sense, that the idea HIV is our friend, that comes out of one of the quotes that was from my fieldwork, reflects the new political negotiations and spaces that were open for sexual minorities, especially when the state was compelled to share power, even though in small ways, with marginalized communities. So in chapter 1, HIV is our friend, I discuss how HIV/AIDS programs moved away from simple condom distribution to complex monitoring and regulatory systems where the involvement of high-risk groups is deemed necessary, regulating sexual behavior at the minute level, from keeping records of condom use, STI testing, mapping the hotspots, number of condoms used by each target in the language of the health programs. It becomes like a new means on mode of governing subjects. So in the same chapter, I offer ethnographic insights from fieldwork in New Delhi, where I shadow peer educator Shamala. Shamala's work in the slum becomes even more difficult when she had to spread this message as a general message on sexual health, because most of the women in the slum, they work, are home-based sex workers, so it was not easy for Shamala to actually, quote unquote, target particular sex workers and give this message, but she was giving this message to women as a group. So even though she did not particularly address women sex workers in the slum, there's a subtle understanding and code through which she communicated with her, with the women sex workers and peer educators. What was fascinating for me is to see how public space of the slum, at least temporarily, transforms, where you see talk about condoms. She openly demonstrates how to use the condom. Of course, this is taking place in the context of sexual risk, and in that context of sexual health programs. It's not my contention that HIV work is uniform or that there's no resistance or critique from these groups towards these interventions. In fact, there has been critique of number-driven, intrusive, and targeted approach by transnational governmentality projects. I am not by any means undermining that critique, but my contention is that we cannot miss the fact that HIV/AIDS governance brings new modes of interactions and relationships between the state and marginalized groups. So my main goal in the book was to establish this transformed relationship between the state and sexual minorities. I kind of, in chapter 2, challenging bare life, uses ethnographic evidence, reports from human rights groups, and other evidence to argue that in the context of HIV/AIDS, state cannot operate purely through only exclusion, juridical exclusion, or criminal laws, but there's a tension that emerges between the juridical and the biopolitical. This was particularly exemplified through the condom wars, where peer educators carrying condoms were subjected to harassment and violence by the police. There are many instances where peer educators were harassed and subjected to violence. The arrest of the NAS Foundation International Barossa Trust members in 2001 illustrates this tension between the juridical and the biopolitical very starkly, wherein HIV/AIDS workers were in this context, organizations working with men who have sex with men groups have been portrayed in popular media as running gay brothels and spreading homosexuality in the name of HIV/AIDS prevention. And NAS Foundation International and Barossa Trust members who are interviewed much later in 2007, they mentioned that even though they were working with the state AIDS control society at that point, they did not receive any support from them. So even the state, state organization which was working with these groups mostly did not take a stand on violence and discrimination faced by sexual minorities. Similarly, there were attacks on groups at Sangama. Sangama reported, several instances where their office was attacked. Sangram, VAMP, DMSC, and many other groups working on HIV/AIDS and sexual minorities are targeted. Human Rights Watch called this the epidemic of abuse. But HIV/AIDS also helped to bring to light the everyday forms of violence, right, that sexual minorities were facing, like extortion, violence, and also impunity with which the police operate. And peer educators were on the forefront of this, bringing this knowledge back to the NGOs. For example, sex workers from Godavari Mahila Samakya in Rajahmundry, Andhra Pradesh. They talked about how, because of the collectivization efforts, they were able to approach the police. Previously, they would hang their head in shame when they have to go to the police station, but now they can they walk there with their head held high. So numerous instances like that where sex workers have spoken to me about how they invite local officials into their platforms where they were able to speak with them, and there's a sense that they can engage with the same state agencies that have previously ridiculed them or completely neglected them. Of course, I mean, I'm not saying this happened all through India, but there definitely wherever sex workers have mobilized and collectivized strongly, this change we could see that change. Sex workers and LGBTQ groups launched a critique of state violence and laws that impact them. So the challenging the anti-sodomy law is again one of the visible challenges we see that starts in 1994 with the AIDS Bhedbhav Virodi Andolan. But then 2001, after the Lucknow incident, arrest of Bharosa and Naz Foundation international representatives, the sodomy law becomes again a major contestation, right? And over 16 years of more of struggle, more than 16 years of struggle. We see different ways in which the law responds to it. So the analytics of biopower politics has helped me to parse out those aspects of the state that are harmful and those that are amenable to the demands of marginalized groups. It is through disaggregating the state we can understand the politics of the governed and their struggles to fight violence and arbitrary state power. So unlike other scholars who think of approach HIV/AIDS as only a regulatory apparatus, I take a position that we need to engage with how this also created space for marginalized groups to speak back to the state and build these struggles around sexuality. The third theoretical main intervention of the book, I think, is the theorizing the contradictory and the fragmentary nature of the Indian state in the context of a global health crisis, right? So I already mentioned about the juridical and the tensions between the juridical and the biopolitical that emerges in the context of HIV/AIDS. Prevention programs, condom distribution, but these contradictions surface quite significantly in the legal and political battles as well. So following transnational feminist scholars, I understand state not as some monolithical, but as fragmented and rift with internal contradictions. More particularly in the context of transnational governmentality, state functions are dispersed. The distinction between state and non-state actors is often hard to make. So in India, the HIV/AIDS governance is undertaken through National AIDS Control Organization, national and transnational NGOs, local grassroots organizations, community-based organizations, which could often produce internal contradictions in the state, right? That tension between the juridical and biopolitical becomes apparent in the legal struggles. In 2005, the ICPA, the Women and Child Development Ministry, introduced the amendments to Immoral Traffic Prevention Act, bringing a clause of criminalizing clients, and it became a flashpoint for sex workers to organize. And they effectively mobilize National AIDS Control Organization, Ministry of Health, and it was there was significant difference between NACO and Women and Child Development Ministry, and I talk about the processes through which these differences our fragmentation in the state are created. Similarly, in the case of Section 377, at various points, NACO, sorry, that was my timer. NACO and the Home Ministry have taken different positions around Section 377 in the courts, the Delhi High Court and the Supreme Court. I don't want to go more in detail about these struggles, but I'm happy to talk more. But this one point I want to also bring up is how the later part of the book talks a lot more about a social movement building again around Section 377 and the NALSA judgment, and also how strategically groups have used NALSA judgment to fight Section 377. The petition by Akai Padamsa from Bangalore is a case in point. She files a petition in the Supreme Court, challenging Section 377 in the light of NALSA. So the contradictions of being granted gender identity rights, but not sexual rights, something that trans groups also highlight and use that to mobilize against Section 377. So this has been a very rich engagement with law and the state, and I just would provide some brief timelines here, just a quick overview of all the struggles that I highlight in the book. I spoke about the legal petition challenging anti-sodomy law that ABVA first petition in 1994, then the 2001 NAS petition, 2005 proposal to introduce amendments to IDPA, then 2009 New Delhi High Court judgment, 2012 NALSA files a petition in the Supreme Court. December 2013, Supreme Court of India reverses the New Delhi High Court decision, and then the NALSA judgment in 2014, right? But the political struggles and the legal gains have been uneven. So we know that September 2018 verdict of the Supreme Court declaring Section 377 unconstitutional, which was a huge victory. And of course, there has been a lot of debates within the LGBTQIA groups about whether Section 377 should be central to queer struggles in India. That's a completely different debate altogether. Definitely Section 377 has galvanized LGBTQI+ groups to in an interesting way throughout the country. Most recently, we see trans rights being undermined through transgender protection, persons protection bill. There's a nationwide mobilization against it, and recently a Supreme Court petition against the bill, and the trafficking of persons bill, right? That your workshop on sex work, you elaborately have spoken about that, but most recently in that workshop you're organized. So thinking about rights as a contested terrain, not as an endpoint, but as a contested terrain for advancing political projects of marginalized groups. So that's where I am going to stop and give the floor to Shakti. Trying to see how I could stop sharing.
Oh, perfect.
Ah.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Chaitanya. Are you all able to hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. So, yeah, thanks so much. I think there's a lot of really novel interventions that you make in the book. I think for one, I've seen there are so many books that do allude to the overlaps between sex worker movements and sexual minority movements in India and trace their link to HIV epidemic. But often this is just told without really showing exactly what that entails and kind of tracking. You so carefully track the moments and the places those dovetail and don't. And I think that's a huge contribution to a lot of us who are working on similar topics. So thank you for that. And I think also, the certain points like the seeming contradiction between NALSA and 377, which at one point in time, I think, especially between 2013 and 2018, that was something that I think a lot of scholars in this area would allude to repeatedly. How do we make sense of this paradox? And I think more than anything, I think your book really actually helps us make sense of that paradox, without just seeing it in a superficial way as the government being inconsistent or something, but pointing to how the two judgments are actually similar in certain ways of, recognizing gender, but not sexual acts. And I think the careful, so this, I think it's fascinating. So thank you. And I think a couple of other contributions. I mean, I think it really updates a lot of the queer anthropology debates from the 90s, when there was like a sort of whole globalization type of versus local instantiation kind of debate of, is this global LGBT discourse producing homonormative identical bodies elsewhere, and people saying, no, there are these local instantiations. But I think you really take that to a next level by showing there are not just local sexual identities, right? There are local forms of ethics and political aspiration and visions for a different society and activism and advocacy. It's not just a matter of recognizing ground ethnographic realities. And I also find it very useful, and I think the kind of you mentioned how there are certain critical queer feminist approaches that dismiss rights discourse as a kind of a liberal farce, and like, and in some ways maybe don't do credit to the multiple lives those rights discourse have in post-colonial countries and multiple ways that they are weaponized and repurposed. And I actually find this even in academic departments. I think, in at least in anthropology at one point, a sort of disturbing trend of, utilizing a critical postmodern lens to completely discredit identity politics and dismiss it as a kind of naive bid for inclusion, which I think is really harmful in the current moment of, minority scholars trying to make a name for themselves in the academy. Like this weaponization of postmodern theory is a bit dangerous. So lots of really powerful interventions. Thank you. I have a few, 4 questions really, which I wanted you to just elaborate on. The first is, you make the point about how life and livability are being renegotiated anew. And, so you depart from a kind of Agamben bare life, idea to say, no, actually the collision between juridical power and biopower produces these gaps where people can renegotiate life. But I was just interested in how does that map onto, non-secular aspirations for what constitutes a good life, what constitutes an ethical life, which go beyond the juridical and biopolitical, right? I think especially in the case of communities you're talking about, they, especially for example, you can say the Hijra community or the Jamaat or goddess worship practices amongst Hijras, like Sami Pattais in Tamil Nadu, that And in another context, Ramberg has written about Jogati communities in Karnataka, or Matama community. There are just lots of communities whose where even human rights framings and different range of activist projects are very uncomfortable with those so-called traditional and non-secular aspects of those communities, right? And I think even in the case of the Jamaat, like while of course lots of queer activists critique the trans rights bill for criminalizing the Jamaat, deeper down, like if you have conversations with people, they do retain profound ambivalence about the Jamaat sometimes as an institution, either romanticizing it as this, the pre-modern haven, of like perfect family, or like dismissing it as a kind of archaic feudal remnant. And even the Pehchan project, which you mentioned, it has this like diva grants and certain grants for kind of modernizing the Jamaat, right? Like I was a part of education workshops to tell Jamaat leaders and senior Nayaks how to understand human rights, how to respect consent. So I think all of this, like where do the people you work with, lots of people get disillusioned with activist and juridical and biopolitical projects alike because of these different non-secular modes of reckoning not finding a place. I was curious about that. Another is about a related question about the fractures and regional variations, I think, in the movement. A lot of the people you talk to are, very heavily involved in the advocacy process, and very tied into those activist networks. And I was just wondering, for example, between the cases of Tamil Nadu and Bombay, right, there's a huge amount of regional opposition, like you mentioned Lakshmi Tripathi a lot, but she's a very notorious figure, even a reviled figure in Tamil Nadu, I would say, where I think lots of Tirunangai leaders see her as this kind of example of North Indian Hindi hegemony, which is making all Hijra, like everyone identify as Hijra, and they trace Tirunangai to a sort of anti-caste, radically secular Dravidian Periyarist genealogy, locating it in a Tamil versus Hindi. So even when you mention Tamil Nadu as a kind of ground zero for some of these moves, like I think it's interesting that Tamil Nadu generated that by positioning itself against a certain conception of Hijra. And that's just one example, but I'm sure you have fieldwork in a lot of other cities. I don't know about Hyderabad and Delhi, and what forms did those vernacular variations take there? A third question I had was just about the bodies of historical scholarship that I'm curious what you find most pertinent to your work. I think, of course, there are so many different bodies at this point of, like Anjali Arandikar, Durba Mitra, different people writing about a certain long-standing discourses, construing homosexuality a certain way, construing the figure of the eunuch, the figure of the prostitute, etc. And lots of materialist work as well. And so just curious about how, because as you say, when communities negotiate livability, they're also challenging their characterization in multiple times. Like, they're so many layers, because for example, Hijra is being accused of kidnapping children. I mean, you worked with Sangama, has experienced this a lot in 2010 time. And at once they're opposing kind of these anti-trafficking discourses. They're opposing criminalization of the Jamaat. They're also revisiting, 18th century arguments that made certain types of families able to own land and not, and certain families as kidnapping, certain families as legitimate. So the layering of these historical discourses are like habitual sodomy, this idea of boys being corrupted. These are all very, very old discourses in India beyond a colonial period. So what you make of those? And lastly, I think this is a more political economy kind of question. I think you make a very valid, I think, point about how...
You'd like to wrap up?
Yeah, sorry. I was just curious about the overlaps between informal sector labor and the people you work with in the context of neoliberalism and governance producing unexpected outcomes in India, not a simple shrinkage of the welfare state. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much, and sorry for my questions being a bit over time.
Oh, no problem. These are such rich questions. And I mean, I love all these questions, but I don't know if I have answers to a lot of this. But your point about the non-secular aspirations is a really, really important point. And I mean, the book really is looking at the side of law and rights, and so definitely that's a big that's a missing piece, right, of the richness of queer lives in India. That is partly the critique of the law that queer groups have, that right, that we are missing these other dimensions of queer lives. And one of the ways in which I think you gave the answer in terms of how the non-secular figures in the human rights framing, especially the way in which the supposedly traditional ways and modes of being are being brought into the criminal ambit, like the within the trans persons bill, begging, right? Begging becomes criminalized, or we were talking about Jamaat, and in the 2005 ITPA amendment, the women in WCD tried to bring. Tripti was pointing that in the workshop. I remember that they tried to introduce traditional prostitution, like criminalizing traditional, like the Devadasi, Jogini, Jogappa kind of tradition. So definitely, the right struggles and the legal struggles definitely point to like, of course, this is a critique of this of Section 377 too, right? That there is a way in which privacy is being privileged. Although I tend to take like the. I agree with the people like Arvind Narayan who talk about how the privacy issues in India come up very differently. It's not so we need to really think carefully about how questions about privacy and rights come up in the Indian struggles. But certainly, I mean, there are these rich texts you point to in terms of like Aniruddin Vasudevan's work on the goddess, and other works who are looking into this non-secular dimensions. So I really think that that's something that the book could not capture because of its focus on HIV and the law, and the state, and it's how the state forecloses, right, some of these ways in which some of the ways of being like that are not that do not fit into this privacy-based models of sexuality. So and I think I'm really looking forward to reading all this rich scholarship that's coming out now that related to that is the vernacular variations, right? I mean, there are you talked about Tripathi, Lakshmi Tripathi. I do use Lakshmi Tripathi's quotes to talk about the contradictions between Nalsa and 377, not so much as like making Tripathi as the important figure of the trans struggles in India, but to just draw out the contradictions. I'm really aware of how divisive Tripathi can be, Lakshmi Tripathi can be, but that wasn't the point of the book there, right? But really, I mean, because of the fact that I focus on the state and social movement relationships, definitely what's missing is also the richness of the struggles and regional variations right? I talk about fractures within the fragmentation of the state, but don't attend much to the like productive tensions within social movements, right? So no, that's another book, hopefully someday in the making. But yeah, fractures and regional variations are really, really important. Even thinking about like Delhi and Bombay, right? In terms of the articulations around Section 377, like there's a more identity-based kind of assertions that emerge from Bombay. In Delhi, there's it's a much more voices against 377 representing this non-identity based approach to looking at Section 377. So there's a lot of richness in, again, in the North and the South, like Tamil Nadu as being the ground zero for the ways in which trans rights have been approached, way in which Tirunangais and Aravanis have kind of pushed this contours of the state. So there are certainly very rich regional variations within even in terms of thinking about sex workers groups, right? The difference between national network and of sex workers and other groups, DMSE and other groups. So there are definitely very rich and productive, often productive engagement with these issues that needs to be captured. And your question about bodies of historical scholarship, and I'm a sociologist, so I do drawing on historical scholarship is very important. Anjali Aronkar's work is very significant in thinking about the colonial archive and Section 377, and even thinking about Ruth Vanita and Salim Kidwai's work, right? Their readings of texts, historical texts, and scriptures and literature. So that's really rich. There's a rich body, definitely, of scholarship, historical scholarship. And as a sociologist, I perhaps might have very superficially engaged with this scholarship, but the Andrea Roker's work is very crucial, key in terms of thinking about, and all the scholarship about Contagious Diseases Act in India, right? Rich feminist scholarship on Contagious Diseases Act and the Criminal Tribes Act that definitely inform how I think about these issues and how I approach these issues. I don't know if I answered your questions, or if there's anything I missed, please let me know.
No, I think that was great. Yeah, not at all to point them out as shortcomings or something. I was just genuinely curious what you thought about them. Yeah, did anyone else want to?
Thank you for this interesting discussion. I think we have a question. This is from Preeti. Let me just read it out. My question is not about the book, but slightly related to sex workers. I think sex workers groups also she means. I wanted to know why feminist groups have not raised voice for the well-being or say mental health of sex workers in India. I'm aware about the legal status of sex workers in India, she says.
Well, I think Prabha can speak a lot to this question more than I can. But as we were talking about in the workshop on sex work, right, we were talking about how feminist engagement with sex work is not it's not uniform, and we were talking in our panel about not using the term abolitionist feminist, but there's a certain kind of the way in which carceral feminism, this idea of asking more criminal laws, stricter trafficking laws become much more prominent since the 2000s or mid 1990s, and how that plays a big role. Definitely the anti-trafficking agendas have become more powerful. I wouldn't say feminists haven't engaged with sex workers in India. Actually, if you think about Meena Seshu, right? I had an interview with Meena Seshu many years ago, and she points out about how she has a background of working with feminist movements. She is a feminist. She's had a background of or being part of feminist movement. Then she works with sex workers, right? So there are those linkages, and I think we need to highlight these linkages more. But I agree that these engagements are more marginal in terms of sex workers' rights in India. I don't know if Prabha wants to add anything.
I think there are a few more questions, so maybe we can.
We have a question from Reshma. Reshma, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, yeah. I'm sorry, for some reason my video is not working. My name is Reshma, and yeah. So my question is again, sincere apologies. I've not read the book. It certainly seems to be a very promising work, and I'll certainly try to get hold of it as soon as I can. It's going to be very useful for my work as well. Now, you talk about the HIV programs and the transformed relationship between the state and sexual minorities, from what I understand from the presentation. So I was wondering if that is as direct or as linear or consequential. I mean, I agree with you in saying that the HIV/AIDS programs gave a certain visibility to some of the sexual minority communities, and it did come about as a certain starting point. Now, if you take the chronology of events, it actually enabled an accelerated mobilization or collectivization of these communities, I would think. So to me, it is not directly it did not directly result in facilitating a dialogue between the community or the movement and the state, I would think. It was, I mean, at that point, it was more of a one-sided, thing, and the tensions, related tensions, enabled the evolution of the movement that is based on rights, which was a shift, right? So that shift, and then so if you take the chronology, I would, to me, that is how it worked. It was not as direct and as linear. I was thinking, I'm not sure if you are saying that it is direct or linear, but then the sense that I get from the discussion and presentation is what makes me say this. And also about what Dr. Shakti said about the regional specificities. Probably you discuss in this also in the book. I mean, as she rightly said, I think the local politics and stories have a lot of bearing on the relationship between the state and the movements also. So, I mean, I work on Kerala, and I mean, it's a totally different story. So, but probably you have taken Kerala or other. I mean, you mentioned Sangama, so certainly the South is also there, but to what extent and so on, I was wondering. And again, South, and the entire South does not have a very similar story either. So yeah, so that's more or less what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
So much.
So Lakshmi Sethi, there's one more question. Maybe you can collect both and answer together. May I request Srila Roy? Professor Srila Roy, could you please unmute and ask your question?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was a really small question, so I thought I would just type it, but I wasn't sure where I could do that. So I was just curious, I mean, in the previous discussion around sex workers and feminist groups, I was just curious about the role that the Indian women's movement and feminist legacies played in this project, because it's interesting to me how there seems to be a lot of interest. I mean, I'm thinking also of Navneeta Mokkal's book. There seems to be a lot of interest around pairing sex workers and queer feminist groups, or looking at lesbians as a category and sex worker categories, but much less in terms of queer, non-queer feminist groups. So I was just interested in that. But you don't have to answer it. I mean,
yeah, no, it's
a lot
fascinating.
more on your table.
I'll take this question and then go back to Reshma's question. I think it's fascinating because, I mean, if you think of Section 377 struggles, queer women have been at the forefront. Feminist groups also have been on the forefront of their struggles, right? So I think there's that's a history, or a sociological analysis that we need to also undertake very carefully. And the kind of support feminist groups have given to Section 377 struggles is important to, like the alliances between feminist groups and queer groups. Queer feminists have to be really written and documented. And Navneeta's work is really a very important work. I take your point. I think that's really important to talk about. But when it comes to trans rights, often I see there's a tension with some women's groups, especially MSM, like gender performativity of. I heard certain feminists kind of having trouble with the way in which femininities are performed by Hijras and MSM Koti community. So it will be an interesting point to also think about. But when it comes to Reshma's question, definitely South India has a very different, and Kerala, of course, has a very rich history of sex worker politics, and lately the trans rights debates in Kerala. I was in Trivandrum last year, and I was speaking to some activists at Queer Rhythm, and the kind of interventions they are making are really fascinating. So even in South, I'm from Andhra, and I've lived in Hyderabad for a long time, and there are groups like Hijra Hakla Samakya in Hyderabad. The kind of issues and issues around caste that they're raising are really, really fascinating. So I think my focus, because of my focus on Section 377, NALSA, and ITPA, my focus has moved away from South India, not because the interventions are not important, but that because of the centrality of the legal and debates, it has moved to that arena. But in terms of whether I'm making a linear relationship between HIV/AIDS and rights struggles, it might have come across in the presentation that it is linear, but I'm not by no way suggesting that there is this very linear, straightforward relationship. And that I think I speak about the Section 377 social movements and how they have moved away from the HIV/AIDS framing, right? And as you yourself mentioned, HIV definitely accelerated the mobilization around these struggles. But by no way, my point, I'm saying that that's the reason why we see these political shifts. More than I think, I'm interested in the power dynamics. So even though HIV has enabled this shift, the way in which the activist groups have engage with the state in these three different contexts is very different, and how they mobilize and how they challenge the state are very different in that sense. So I really take your point very seriously about the linearity and how this might come across as a linear connection between HIV and the rights-based discourses. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Chaitanya. I think we have another question or comment from Prabha.
Hi, Chaitanya. Thank you so much for this really, really wonderful book. I couldn't manage to finish it, unfortunately, but I read about 50 pages of it, and it's absolutely gripping. And really, it's a terrific book, and I know I'm going to be coming back to it quite frequently in the future. So I guess I wanted to pose a question to you, which really Siddharth started off with when we had our webinar with the sex worker groups, which was to say that, when he started out as a gay man writing on the HIV epidemic, he thought that sex workers would find decriminalization sooner than the LGBT community. Mm-hmm. And here I sense that, obviously, no matter how limited or liberal the promises are of sort of quote one victories or legislations for the trans community and the LGBT community, I think sex workers' struggles have really suffered, through repeated attempts to further criminalize the sector. So I'm just wondering whether, is it just that we will always be out of bounds in terms of the promises of the law, despite a very robust institutional framework for public interest litigation, and will we always just be outside of those victories? And I guess the second question was about the social movement mobilization, and apologies if you've covered this already in your book, but just in terms of resource mobilization, all three movements, if they derived considerable resources from the HIV movement, I know certainly that the sex workers movement, although it's become more mature, has actually lost some of the initial energy it had, during the times of the big melas and stadiums and so on in Calcutta. So, and certainly that was cited as a reason when, we were mobilizing against the trafficking bill, that a protest rally was no longer possible like it was in 2005, to 2009. But I'm just curious about what is it about the other two movements? Where are the resources coming from? Certainly, Navdeep Johar benefited from some very elite, prominent personalities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As well,
I'm sorry, Prabha. I think
sex workers movement. Yeah, go ahead. That's it.
For a couple seconds.
Hello? No, just repeat the last part of your question. Yeah. We couldn't hear that.
No, just that the loss of HIV, the sex workers movement has. Is that the case for the other two movements, or are there just more elite protagonists within the movement who are willing to take at least the?
Yeah.
Already talking about same-sex marriage and so on.
Mm-hmm. These are really, really important questions. I think, as you mentioned, right, in 2005, when the ITPA amendments were introduced, when I was talking to some of the sex workers groups in 2007 and 2009, they were talking about how they were able to go to Delhi. Like there was a huge HIV meeting that was organized in Delhi, and all the sex workers groups were able to go. And then after the conference, they went and protested. So there are definitely, those ways in which, social movements were able to mobilize because of HIV money. In the case of sex workers, even some of the sex workers collectives who formed independently, of the HIV groups were all attached to the HIV/AIDS programs, and they did have their independent role they played. But some of the prominent ones like the Godavari Mahila Samakya or the DMSE, they all had HIV intervention programs, so which really helped them to mobilize. But when it comes to trans groups and LGBTQ groups, I think initially HIV money was very helpful. I think in one of the interviews I had with Abina Ahar, she works for the Pehchan project, and she said something very poignant to me. She said, we don't see trans men as visibly in the movement as trans women. Trans men's voices are marginalized. She talks about how HIV/AIDS, because they mostly work with trans women's groups and hijra groups, has given them a space to mobilize. And when it comes to Section 377 struggles, initially the HIV money was very instrumental in mobilization. Of course, I think the class is very important. Social class is very important in these struggles, and as you mentioned, right? I mean, there are elite middle class and elite groups that were helping Section 377 struggles. But when it comes to sex workers and trans rights, we don't have as much of that going for those groups. So I think it's very important to talk about the class nature of these struggles. And in terms of what Siddharth Narayan's comment is, I think it's very important. It's very, it highlights, right, how sex worker struggles have been sidetracked by the anti-trafficking agendas, and you have been writing about this, Prabha, a lot. They are constantly having to, fight anti-trafficking agendas, and their resources being completely diverted to these. And anti-trafficking groups have a lot of resources, and they have a lot of support that sex workers groups don't have. And if you think of the HIV/AIDS history, I mean, sex workers have really the initial groups which have made great strides in terms of showing that they are able to manage these programs, and they had created this space for other sexual minority groups to enter the field. And it is unfortunate that we see that sex workers haven't really gained the same kind of visibility as other sexual minority groups. But I think what is interesting for me, I want to research, it would be interesting to research more, but with the new trafficking bill, there are many more voices other than the sex workers groups that we often see, like a number of trans groups are talking about it, LGBT groups are talking about it. I know it's not the same energy, but I feel like there are more people talking against the new trafficking bill that was presented in the Parliament. So that's my sense.
I think there are no more questions in the chat box. So we come to a close to this very, very interesting session. And thank you, Professor Lekimsetti, for a fascinating presentation and a very rich and in-depth discussion, to you as well as to Shakti, and also for becoming part of our monthly webinar series. So
yes, thank you so much.
So also look forward to some of our new participants to follow us and become part of our webinar series. So thank you. And Prabha, if you would like to say some.
Oh, no, not at all. Thank you so much, Chaitanya. And, definitely, I think, our conversations will continue, hopefully, for several such sessions. So it was very rewarding and very stimulating. Thank you. Thank you so much for your book.
Thank you so much. This was very, very rewarding. And thank you for all your questions and your comments and giving me the space to talk about the book. And I'm really looking forward to engaging with you all in future. And hopefully be part of this. I definitely want to be part of this seminar as much as I can.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks for the space.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.